Hi everyone, this is the video for the rest of Aristotle's NE Bk in Ethics. Oops. The discussion for this part of Aristotle's NE Bk in Ethics, book 7, has to do with different types of moral failing that can occur. Right. So the general idea here is that we've already seen how we are supposed to achieve morality, right? What virtue is, what the different types of or the different kinds of moral and intellectual virtues, and how we attain virtue through habituation and education. But Aristotle recognizes that sometimes we fail to do what we're supposed to do to become moral. And so he says there are various ways in which we can fall below the ideal for the virtuous person. This is especially the case because as we've seen, This is especially the case because as we've seen, being virtuous for Aristotle is a tall order, right? You have to have all of the moral virtues, all of the intellectual virtues. Essentially, you got to be perfect. And he says he understands that this is difficult. His response to that is, yeah, it's difficult to be moral. If it was easy, everyone would be moral, and we wouldn't think that morality was something to be especially praised or esteemed. Right? We hold people up as moral exemplars partly because it's so difficult to achieve that status, right? And so here in book 7, he talks about different ways in which people can fail to be moral, and kind of where we might fit upon a scale of morality. He talks about 4 different sort of levels of morality, beginning with intemperance and ending with temperance. So we'll go through each of those 4. So intemperance is kind of the worst place that you can be, morally speaking. The intemperate person is a person who has base desires, so they desire bad things, immoral things, vicious things, and they don't actually understand that their desires are base, right? So this person doesn't regret being vicious because they don't understand that they're actually a vicious person. So it couples a kind of deficiency in desire with a deficiency in understanding. Aristotle considers this type of person to be practically incurable. This is because it's going to require substantial intellectual and moral education, right? That it's not going to be enough just to teach someone about morality, but then they're also going to have to change their desires, and that's a tall order. Even for the person who already has understanding, it's difficult to change their desires. So because you kind of have twice as much work to do, and only one lifetime to do it in, this is going to be especially difficult moral problem to solve. And for that reason, the intemperate person is kind of the worst, the most vicious type of person. If you're slightly higher on the scale of morality, you are an incontinent person. The incontinent person still has the base desires, still has the desire to have vicious things, or to do vicious things. However, they have the understanding that those desires are wrong, right? So they know that they shouldn't have the desires, they would like to change, but sort of when push comes to shove, they still end up doing wrong. So the idea here for the incontinent person is essentially that they have a weakness of will. They are swayed by their desire, by their passions. So they still do bad, but they understand that it's wrong, they regret their actions, they'd like to do better, they just haven't been able to yet habituate their desires to learn to control their actions, right? So still not a virtuous person because they're still doing vicious things. But they're at least better than the intemperate person because they understand that what they're doing is wrong. Whereas the intemperate person didn't really understand and so didn't have any regret. Right. This is the person who acts contrary to reason. Oops. Oh well. Yeah. So the incontinent person is acting contrary to reason. They don't understand, or that they understand that what they're doing is wrong, but they can't help but do it. Better than the incontinent person is the continent person. This person still has the base desires, still desires vicious things. However, they have reached the point in their moral and intellectual development where they are actually able to control those desires. So they end up doing the right actions. Right? They are able to restrain themselves and act in a way that is right, in a way that is in accordance with virtue, despite the fact that their actual desires are not virtuous. This person is quite far along in the process of becoming moral, right? Because they already have full understanding, and they already have begun to change their desires as well, right? They understand what the right thing is. They do the right thing. It's just that part of them still wishes they could do the vicious actions instead. Right? They're not actually taking pleasure in their virtuous actions. And that is the part that keeps them from being the actually virtuous person. Right? That they don't have that element of taking pleasure in their virtue. And finally, you have the temperate person, the person who understands what's right, does those right things, and actually takes pleasure in those actions. They have good desires, they desire to do virtuous things, they do those virtuous things, they take pleasure in doing them. Right? This is essentially the virtuous person. Because their desires, their actions, their understanding all are in accord with one another. If we think of a kind of example to maybe see the difference among these four types of people, I think the easiest example is maybe moderation, right? The virtue of temperance or moderation that we learned about last week. So you might have the intemperate person, right? Well, we'll say we agree with Aristotle. Moderation or temperance with respect to food is a virtue. And so the truly virtuous person is going to be moderate in their food intake. The intemperate person, so the worst person, the person who is very close to actual viciousness, if not actually vicious, desires to only eat ice cream sundaes, eats those ice cream sundaes, and doesn't think they've done anything particularly wrong. They don't think that there's a problem with being immoderate. Right? This is the worst place to be, according to Aristotle, because how are they ever going to change? Right? They don't realize that they're doing wrong, so it's going to be difficult for them to realize that they have to change. And then even if, they get some help and somebody explains things to them, they're still going to have the problem of fully accepting that explanation, understanding why moderation is important, and then changing their actions and their desires to suit the virtue. So that's going to be extremely difficult. Right. The person who's a bit further along in their quest for virtue is going to be the incontinent person. The incontinent person still wants to eat the ice cream sundaes, but they understand that they should be moderate. Right? They've at least learned that moderation is a virtue, that moderation is something that we ought to strive for, and so they say, I'm going to be moderate, right? I'm going to start to eat healthier. But when they're confronted with the ice cream in the grocery store, despite the fact they understand they shouldn't buy it, they buy it, right? And they eat it. And then they say, oh gosh, I messed up. I was supposed to be moderate. I let my desire for ice cream get the best of me. I'm going to have to try again. Right. So they still end up doing the vicious thing, being immoderate. But they understand that it was wrong. They're trying to cure themselves. Right. Even better is the incontinent person. The incontinent person wants to eat the ice cream. Still has that desire to be immoderate. But they understand that moderation is a virtue, that moderation will be good for them in the long run. And when they're confronted with the ice cream in the grocery store, they're able to restrain themselves and not buy it. Right? They wish they could eat it. They feel that they're kind of losing out by not getting the ice cream, but they act in accord with the virtue and make the moderate choice. Right. So they're pretty far along. They have understanding. Their actions are in accord with their understanding. They just kind of feel that loss that they wish they could do differently. They wish that it would be right to eat the ice cream. The temperate person is kind of furthest along because they don't actually want the ice cream. It's not a matter of restraining themselves. Oops. It's not a matter of restraining themselves because their desires are to be temperate. And then all they have to do is act in accordance with those desires for temperance or moderation and not eat the ice cream. They don't feel that they're missing out. They don't think like the incontinent person or like the continent person did, gosh, I wish I could have that ice cream. They're perfectly happy to be moderate. Right? And that's what puts them above the continent person. That their desires, their understanding, and their actions are all in accordance with one another and for virtue. So after providing this account of ways in which we might fail morally, Aristotle says a few things in the books that we're skipping about friendship and the importance of friendship, morally speaking. Oops. But then he goes on in book 10 to talk in sort of a summative way about happiness, which he spent a lot of time on in book 1, and especially about this ideal form of happiness which comes from the life of contemplation. Right? And so in revisiting happiness, Aristotle essentially summarizes what he's already told us in book 1, the arguments he's already made. The happiness is the good for the human being. It's the only thing that's good in itself. It's desired for its own sake. It's complete and self-sufficient. He thinks happiness is the only thing that fits those criteria. He reminds us that although many people might think that pleasure fits this criteria, it's not complete in the way that happiness is. He says pleasure is a good, but not the good, because we can take pleasure in doing good things or bad things. And we just had an example of that with the continent and incontinent and temperate person. So, right, some of whom take pleasure in the good instead of the bad, or in the bad instead of the good, right? And so, happiness can't be equated with pleasure. Instead, he says, true human happiness must be tied to something that's distinctively human. Human beings are rational. He says this is our defining feature, the thing that human beings do that no other creature does. And so true human happiness must be tied to reason. He says every other good that a person does is perfected when we're rational and when we take pleasure in our rational activities. And then he says the most rational type of life, which will necessarily be the happiest, is going to be the life of contemplation. So he has this quote here from chapter 7 of book 10. If happiness is activity in accordance with virtue, it is reasonable that it should be in accordance with the highest virtue. And this will be that of the best thing in us. The activity of this in accordance with his proper virtue, will be perfect happiness. This activity is contemplative, right? So contemplation, study, philosophical study in particular, is the activity that most fully engages our intellect and our reason. And since that's the highest faculty that we have as human beings, it makes sense that this is going to be the highest activity that we can do, and thus the activity that will make us most happy. He also points out that contemplation fits these other criteria that we've already talked about for happiness as well. For example, he says that the life of contemplation is the most pleasant type of life, that it's the most enjoyable. He also notes that it's the most continuous. You can contemplate for longer stretches of time than you can do physical activities, right? They're less physically taxing, and so you can do them for a more continuous period of time. Contemplation is complete and self-sufficient. You contemplate for its own sake, not for some other reason, in the way that you might do other things for an alternative motive, right? For what you're going to get out of them. He says that contemplation is its own reward, right? Thinking about the truth is its own reward. And this sort of goes along with the next point, that it's enjoyed for itself, right? You don't want it for what it can get you, the way that you want money for what it can get you, but you want to contemplate the truth for its own sake. And finally, he says it requires the fewest external goods. If we remember from book 1, he says that virtue, or that happiness requires virtue, pleasure, and external goods. But Aristotle says that contemplation requires fewest external goods, right? In order to, say, be generous, you need to have money, you need to have people to be generous towards, you need to have a system by which your generosity can be conducted, you need time to go and be generous, right? It requires a lot of extra things, whereas contemplation, all you need is yourself and your mind, which is already there for you, right? He says contemplation is maybe more fun when you do it with other people, when you talk philosophy with other people, for example, but it's not a requirement in the way that the external goods are required for most of the moral virtues that we've already investigated. Right. And so he has this other important quote from from chapter 7 of book 10, which is meant to address the concern that many people have that contemplation, to ask people to contemplate, to ask people to study and to think about the truth all the time, that's just too much to ask, right? It's just too much. Most people can't do that. And Aristotle responds thusly. So he says, "But such a life would be too high for man. For it is not insofar as he is man that he will live so, but insofar as something divine is present in him. And by so much as this is superior to our composite nature, it is its activity superior to that which is the exercise of the other kind of virtue. If reason is divine, then in comparison with man, the life according to it is divine in comparison with human life. But we must not follow those who advise us, being men, to think of human things, and being mortal of mortal things. But must, as far as we can, make ourselves immortal, and strain every nerve to live in accordance with the best thing in us. For even if it be small in bulk, much more does it in power and worth surpass everything. This would seem, too, to be each man himself, since it is the authoritative and better part of him. It would be strange, then, if he were to choose not the life of his best self, but the life of something else. And what we said before will apply now. That which is proper to each thing is by nature best, and most pleasant for each thing. For man, therefore, the life according to reason is best and pleasantest, since reason, more than anything else, is man. This life, therefore, is also the happiest. So we can see in this quote, kind of sums up the things that we've just been talking about, that the human being, because we are at our essence rational, because our ability to reason, our intellect, is the best part of us, the highest part of us, the most unique part of us, Aristotle says we ought to try as much as we can to live in accordance with that reason, to make our life's activity a rational activity. And he recognizes this is going to be difficult, because this is a life that is going to that is going to be focused on the very best in us, instead of a more rounded life that takes all of the elements of the human being into account. But he says still, if we want to be our best selves, we have to try as much as we can to live this best life. It is unclear whether Aristotle thinks that this life of contemplation is the only life that is a truly virtuous life, or whether we can also live a life of moral virtue. Most people think he wants moral virtue to be a kind of close second to this life of contemplation, but there are other scholars who think that they ought to be on equal footing. Because Aristotle does recognize that this is difficult, that many people cannot achieve the life of contemplation, and so perhaps the life of moral virtue, becoming as virtuous as humanly possible, with all 8 of those moral virtues and the intellectual virtues as well, might be the best kind of life that most people can have, and perhaps we ought to hold that in equal standing to this life of contemplation. So it's up for debate in the philosophical community regarding Aristotle, because Aristotle himself is not clear. But I'll just sort of leave it for you to decide what you think Aristotle means here. Is the life of contemplation the only best life, or should we also be satisfied if we achieve the life of moral virtue, which is what we've talked about for most of the Nicomachean ethics? So that is the rest of the Nicomachean ethics. I will point out, obviously, Aristotle is an ancient Greek philosopher. There is a lot of time between him and us. However, virtue theory is not a dead theory. There are virtue theorists even today. It experienced especially a resurgence in the last, 20, 30 years in the philosophical community. And the article that you are reading this week, along with this last bit of Aristotle, provides an account of how virtue might be useful today. Maybe not as a standalone theory, the way that Aristotle wants us to view it, but as a complement to other theories, right? And so hopefully that can help us to see how even an ancient theory like Aristotle's is something that still has relevance in our contemporary society. So that is it for this week. Hope you enjoyed learning about Aristotle and virtue theory. Next week we'll be talking about St. Thomas Aquinas and natural law and medieval philosopher and his theory. And so I will see you all next week.